Okay.
Please.
So hello, everybody. It's good to see you. As we gather here tonight, I must note that today has been one of the hardest days since the war began, with millions of Israelis forced into shelters and casualties also reported. So if you have a siren during the meeting, feel free to leave us. If you have enough time, write on the chat. We also hold in our thoughts the 101 hostages still held by Hamas, hoping for their swift return. These ongoing traumas, both collective and individual, make tonight's discussions about Arik Fromm particularly poignant and timely. Fromm's deep understanding of trauma, his insights about hope in the face of destruction, and his emphasis on maintaining our humanity during times of crisis resonate powerfully with our current reality. In an era of global upheaval and rising dictatorships, Arik Fromm's insights feel more relevant than ever. As mental health professionals, we face complex challenges. How do we maintain our therapeutic presence in a fragmented world? How do we help our patients navigate their personal struggles amid society's turmoil? Tonight, we explore these questions through the work of two distinguished scholars, Rog'er Pryay and Sandra Buechler. My name is Aner Govrin, and with me, Sharon Ziv Beyman, my colleague and good friend. Hi, Sharon.
Hi, Aner. Hi, Roger. Hi, Sandra.
Hi.
Hi, everybody. We are very excited and honored to be here tonight, and together to overcome the stress we have here around the missiles, and to look for humanity wherever possible. So thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
So we are here tonight to launch two new books. Dr. Rog'er Pryay's Edge of Catastrophe, Arik Fromm, Fascism and the Holocaust. Rog'er's book unveils heartbreaking letters written by Fromm's family members in their final years. These previously unpublished letters chronicle their suffering from the late 1930s until their deportation to death camps. Though Fromm never spoke openly about his murdered relatives, he kept these letters among his most precious possessions until his death, Rog'er writes. The letters offers us a window into Fromm's inner world and help us understand how personal trauma shaped his theoretical contributions. Dr. Sandra Buechler's Arik Fromm, A Contemporary Introduction, shows us how Fromm's work can guide modern clinicians. Sandra demonstrates how his ideas provide both theoretical depth and practical wisdom for our daily practice. Fromm offers clinicians a unique framework. He connects individual psychological health with broader society's well-being. His focus on love, freedom, and authentic living directly addresses our challenges in the consulting room. As Sandra shows us, Fromm can be an internal mentor for therapists at every career stage. He helps us maintain our sense of purpose and professional vitality. So allow me to introduce our two guests. Dr. Sandra Buechler is a renowned psychoanalyst, training and supervising analyst at the William Ellenson White Institute. Her influential books include the Gradiva Award-winning Making a Difference in Patients' Lives, Still Practicing the Heartaches and Joys of Clinical Career, Understanding and Treating Patients in Clinical Psychoanalysis, Lessons from Literature, and Psychoanalytic Approaches to Problems in Living. Dr. Rog'er Fry is a distinguished scholar, professor of education at Simon Fraser University, affiliate professor of psychiatry at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, and psychoanalytic faculty and supervisor at the William Alanson White Institute in New York. A clinical psychologist, psychoanalyst, historian, and social philosopher, Fry is the author and editor of numerous acclaimed works, including the award-winning book, Not in My Family, German Memory and Responsibility After the Holocaust, and History Flows Through Us, Germany, the Holocaust, and the Importance of Empathy. Hello, Sandra and Roger. It is a pleasure having you with us, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
It's an honor to be here.
Yes.
So I would like to ask each of you to describe your book and what led you to the study of Erich Fromm. Roger, you can start, please.
You want me to start? I think Erich Fromm has always been a part of my life, if I could put it that simply. I grew up seeing his books on the shelves of my parents. I grew up hearing his work talked about, perhaps most particularly when I visited Germany, because I grew up primarily in Canada and Switzerland. And when I attended university, I sought to understand my own German background better. And I turned to Erich Fromm as a university student to read Fear of Freedom, as it's called in the UK, or Escape from Freedom, as it's called in the United States. And I think ultimately Fromm was the reason that I ended up training at the William Alanson White Institute, since he was one of the co-founders. So in a sense, he's been a part of my own personal and professional journey all the way through. I've returned to Fromm now, in part related to the work that I have been doing, specifically on the Holocaust and German memory, and most specifically on how psychoanalysis might respond to our current social and political crises. And I think in that context, Fromm's life and Fromm's work and Fromm's teachings have a lot to tell us.
Tell us more about your book.
Sure. Yeah, I wasn't sure how much detail you wanted me to go into. Let me give it a try. And that is that quite some years, I've been working on this book on and off for at least 10 years. So it's been a long work in progress. And it's a work that is based entirely on archival research and documentation, much of which had not previously been published. And what essentially happened, with the assistance of Rainer Funk, who was Fromm's last personal assistant, I learned of these letters in Fromm's family. And I was quite stunned when I learned about them, because one of the things that, of course, distinguishes Fromm amongst other European Jewish refugee and emigre analysts of the period was Fromm was one of the few analysts to speak openly and publicly against fascism and National Socialism, not only in hindsight, but while it was emerging in the 1930s, and then most specifically in his book, Escape from Freedom in 1941. And I'd always been stunned by that. There was an element of courage in his work that really stood out to me. What I did, of course, did not know, and what had not been talked about, was this family background. And the fact that throughout the period that Fromm was formulating the arguments, thinking them through, figuring out how he might apply psychoanalysis to this period of severe social and political crises, he was actively engaged in a campaign to save family members who remained in Nazi Germany. Very few would survive. But what these letters show us is a different side of Fromm. Fromm was famously private. He shared very little of his personal experience publicly. And so with these letters, we begin to glimpse what he himself was experiencing And I think these letters form what, to my mind, has always been a missing backdrop to understand this unique psychoanalyst, a psychoanalyst who bridged the clinical world and the social and political world in a way that few other psychoanalysts did then or have since. And so that was very much the motivation to write this book, and also to ask how it was, in essence, that we hadn't talked about this previously. Right? It seemed just to be an entirely missing chapter.
Who were these relatives, and what are the content of these letters?
So I'm actually speaking to you from Berlin. I'm currently a fellow at the Center for Research on Anti-Semitism here in Berlin. And it's actually quite poignant to be talking about this, because here again, we often think about Fromm as an American or as a German American, but I think what's often overlooked is the fact that he was a German Jewish refugee. And much of his life was shaped by his years in Berlin. Although he grew up with his family in Frankfurt, in Berlin is where most of his relatives lived. And he visited throughout his life. In Berlin is also where he trained at the Berlin Psychoanalytic Institute, which was really the most radical politically of all the analytic institutes. And in Berlin is where his aunts lived. And those are who the letters were written by. And it is also from Berlin that they were deported. In fact, very close to where I'm currently living. And so this city, in many ways, both its culture, its dynamism, its politics, its society, shaped Fromm's ideas and his outlook. And the letters were written by his aunts. What they reveal are Fromm's many, many attempts to rescue them, to seek to help them in any way he could. Also his connections and attempts to rescue his cousin. And so there are many different people actually involved in the letters. And Fromm stood out within his family because Fromm was one of the few to not only have escaped Nazi Germany, but to have an income as a professional in New York, as a tenured professor at the Institute for Social Research. And so all of the letters essentially reached him, as did all the pleas for help, because he was seen as the member of the family who was most likely to be able to help his relatives to escape. Right? So he became sort of the center of a correspondence that sort of went from relative to relative to relative.
Right. And I read these letters, and they are heartbreaking, right? There is a plea for more money and help, but they are also part of them. There is a part also optimistic, especially from his aunt, I think, that she says in one letter that she still thinks about the world as beautiful, and she still thinks of people as good, and these all influence his thoughts.
Yes, what was stunning to me, knowing Fromm's work, and as particularly his later work, some of the works for which he's most well known, such as The Art of Loving, is I could hear echoes of those letters. And specifically the letters written by one of his aunts, who was a social worker and a teacher, and who really emphasized, she survived in a ghetto in southeast Poland throughout the years from 1939 to 1943, and was ultimately murdered at Treblinka. But throughout those years, she was essentially the caretaker of children in that ghetto. And she talks about the role of love and its instrumental importance in sustaining everyone's lives and togetherness in the midst of circumstances that we can't possibly imagine. Right? And these letters are just enormously poignant and powerful And as I say, there are echoes of that in Fromm's later emphasis on a sense of connectedness to others. Right? What I think distinguished Fromm is the early critique that he made of Freud, and specifically a rejection of Freud's emphasis on aggression, innate aggression. And he did so also in connection with Martin Buber. And this is another really important historical connection to understand. And that is that Erich Fromm and Martin Buber both taught at what was called the Free Learning Center in Frankfurt in the period of 1919 to 1921. And it was precisely this time that Martin Buber was writing I and Thou. And this undoubtedly had a direct influence on Fromm's ideas, because we find those same ideas connected with I and Thou, or in German Ich und Du, in Fromm's work, repeated over and over again. Also in terms of how Fromm understands the therapeutic relationship. Right? So there are all of these, I think, hugely important and also really fascinating connections that have long not been fully understood.
Can you expand a little about that? How Fromm understood the therapeutic relations?
Oh, absolutely. And I'm sure that Sandra will expand on this as well. But I think first and foremost, there's a paper, an article. I'm particularly interested in the early Fromm. So the Fromm that we know less about, because we tend to associate Fromm with the Escape from Freedom publication in 1941. But many of Fromm's most important psychoanalytic works were published in German in the 1930s. So essentially in this decade of social crisis in which he himself moved first to Switzerland and then to the United States. And in 1935, Fromm wrote an article called The Social Determinants of Psychoanalytic Therapy. And in this article, he aligns himself with the works of Sandor Ferenczi. And he knew Sandor Ferenczi personally, and he would often meet with Ferenczi when Ferenczi was at Grodek's sanatorium, as did Frieda von Reichmann, as did Karen Hornheim. So they were all personally acquainted with Ferenczi. And this was another chapter that we tend to have overlooked, because we associate Ferenczi's work with individuals, for example, like Clara Thompson, who was also one of the founders of interpersonal psychoanalysis. But he found in Ferenczi an ally, specifically an ally contra Freud. And what he really emphasized, starting in this article, was the role of relatedness to the patient. And he essentially rejected Freud's early emphasis on neutrality and this metaphor of the analyst as a surgeon. And instead, he actually uses these words. He talks about the possibility of being kind and nice to one's patients, right? It's hardly something we think about as radical today. But when Fromm wrote this in 1935, it really was radical. And in fact, it got him into a lot of trouble. And it was as a result of this article that he was ultimately asked, or literally pushed out of the Institute for Social Research, because he was no longer seen as a Freudian. Right? So that's where you get some of these early kernels of his later work then on the therapeutic relationship.
Yes. And so why in our era that there is lots of dictatorship and what's going on in many countries, not just in the US after Trump's second election, what relevancy do Fromm have to understanding these political phenomena of fascism, dictatorship, and countries that the leader becomes the center and the focus of, and his needs become the center of the country, and there is no less solidarity between the citizens?
So this is a very important question. Of course, it's a very large question. So I will try to be brief because I want to make sure that Sandra has enough time as well. Two things I would say to answer that. The first one is that what made Fromm stand out again is that he argued that it is not enough for the therapist to focus only on the well-being of the patient. The patient's well-being, indeed the therapist's well-being, is directly connected to the health and well-being of society. As such, the therapist always needs to be educated in how society works and be able to address society critically. And this is really fundamental to understanding who Fromm was, not only as a thinker, but as a clinician. Many of Fromm's later works were focused on society, not directly on clinical ideas. There are a host of reasons for that, but we can leave that aside for the moment. But I thought I would read you just one quote, and this is from a book that Fromm wrote in 1964 in response to the civil rights movement in the United States. And it has to do with the notion of group narcissism. And it relates directly to the question you posed, Anna, and that is, how can we understand the willingness of individuals to submit to authoritarian systems and authoritarian leaders? And let me read you this quote, and I'll read it slowly so that everyone can follow along. The highly narcissistic group is eager to have a leader with whom it can identify itself. The leader is then admired by the group, which projects its narcissism onto him. In the very act of submission to the powerful leader, which is in depth an act of symbiosis and identification, the narcissism of the individual is transferred onto the leader. The greater the leader, the greater the follower. Personalities who, as individuals, are particularly narcissistic are the most qualified to fulfill this function. The narcissism of the leader who is convinced of his greatness and who has no doubts is precisely what attracts the narcissism of those who submit to him. The half-insane leader is often the most successful one. This was written before the election of Trump. I just important to point out. But what we can see, the ideas in that actually emerge out of the book Escape from Freedom. Because, of course, he was writing at that time to try to answer the question of how it was that his neighbors in Germany were supporting Hitler. How to begin to make sense of this fact. And narcissism and group narcissism, which he also referred to as racial narcissism, became a very important concept for him to explain that process.
Okay. Thank you. We will get back to you. Now for Sandra's book. Sandra, can you please tell us about your book and about your connection to Fromm?
Sure. Well, like Rog'er, I fell in love, I would say, with Fromm as an undergraduate. That was the start of my thinking about his ideas. And read him again in graduate school in psychology, and again at the William Lansing White Institute, where I also trained. But where he became so meaningful for me was my first jobs as a psychologist. I was a psychologist in the veterans hospitals during the Vietnam War. And so there were young men who were coming to the hospital who had lost all their limbs, some of their limbs, and other injuries, and were emotionally very distraught in many ways. And I also worked on chronic wards in the state hospitals of New York. And so during that period of my career, I was in situations that were just extremely painful and difficult. And I was looking for some way of finding both meaning and hope in the work, in doing treatment in these situations. And Fromm is one of the people who gave me that sense of purpose about treatment, and that sense of trying to have courage, trying moment by moment to choose life when there was a choice, to vote in favor of it in some way, in the way that I was doing my work with people, and to have some kind of active hope, not just passive hope, really, but active hope, which was one of his concepts. So my connection with Fromm was really confirmed during those years, early years in my own professional development. I also feel like something I want to do and try to do with this book is to translate his ideas, his beliefs, his values into clinical action. What do you actually do in a session with a human being that is derived in some way from Fromm? Because that's one thing he didn't do. Roger alluded to this, that he didn't write a lot about clinical technique, even though he was a psychoanalyst. And one of the reasons for that, as I understand it, is he was afraid that if he got too specific about a clinical technique, that people would, the clinicians would not use their spontaneity. They would become kind of mini Erich Fromms in some way. And so he didn't write about that. And I respect the reasons he didn't write about it, but I think it's extremely important to write about it. So I've tried to do that in this book and other places. Now, how do we take Fromm's views about purpose, Fromm's integrity, his really belief in being with people as you believe one should be, is his wholeness, his belief in what he sometimes calls center to center relating, his belief that health is about diminished dissociation, that dissociation is really one of the central problems in life, that more than repression, he believed in the concept of dissociation, that what we can't be conscious of is not only what we were conscious of and had to block out because of conflict, but what our society filtered out of our consciousness, what we were never, in a sense, permitted to be conscious of, what he called the social filter. So that his main concept in terms of what we're doing, what we're working on with people, is to help them dissociate less, basically. And so that, to me, is a very actionable idea. You can think about how to actually use it in a session with a person. And so the center relating, I'll just read a little quote from him. He said, the task of analysis is that the patient experiences something and not that he thinks more. Using Fromm, I think, is about trying to have an actual live moment with someone that might help them not only become more able to use all of who they could be, not only become more conscious of their experience, but actually be able to then go out and have other experiences with other people that widen their horizons. So we're trying to actually have an experience with someone and not just help them create a better theory of themselves. Couple of other quotes I'll just read. Indeed, we must become aware in order to choose the good, but no awareness will help us if we've lost the capacity to be moved by the distress of another human being, by the friendly gaze of another person, by the song of a bird, by the greenness of grass. And he was a humanist in a very profound sense and really tried to help people become less lonely with their suffering. He believed in directly addressing suffering, not going around it, but going through it. But that the way you can bear doing that is if you're not alone doing it. That loneliness is so exacerbates suffering that people can't stand it. And about the role of the therapist, analyst, he said something interesting that I tried to find my own spin on. He said, quote, "Then I do not think about myself. Then my ego does not stand in the way. But something entirely different happens. There's what I call a central relatedness between me and him. He's not a thing over there which I look at, but he confronts me fully, and I confront him fully. And there's, in fact, no escaping from that." So I took that idea and developed it in my own way. I've tried to spin some of his ideas. And I developed the idea of non-narcissistic investments in life and in treatment. The idea being that I do care. I'm not neutral. I do care about the outcome. I do care about the person's life and the quality of their life. But I don't care about it because I need a success to make myself feel like I'm a great therapist. I don't need it for narcissistic reasons. I need it because I'm invested in life and therefore in that person's life as well as in my own life. So the other thing that I think is really very important in Fromm is how he can inspire new clinicians or people who are becoming clinicians, not just because of the values that he expresses and that I think can be translated into action. That's important. But I think also because he helps us use all of who we are in the work so that we don't compartmentalize the lover of music that we might be, the family member we might be, the moviegoer we might be. We don't compartmentalize that. We use all of it in the work. We use all of it to create what I've called a signature style of treatment, to develop our own way of doing the work. And Fromm has very much guided me in my own development in that sense. So these are some of my feelings about Fromm.
So Sandra, if I might ask sort of, I don't know if it's provocative or like, so in what way he was a psychoanalyst? Like,
yes, well, that's a very good question because it comes up a lot. For one thing, people who are more trained in a sort of classic Freudian training will look at Fromm and say, "Oh, that's superficial. That's that's on the conscious level. Doesn't really get to the unconscious," which I really think is just factually not true. He talked a lot about the unconscious, but he talked about it in his own way. So what is psychoanalytic? Well, I mean, there are so many different definitions of that. One of my supervisors was Bill Bromberg, who said, once said that psychoanalysis is a process that looks at itself, which I thought was really succinct and didn't require you to be Jungian or Freudian or Frommian. It's a process that looks at itself. If you accept that as one aspect of what is analytic, Fromm is certainly analytic. There's no question. I think there can't be, if you read him, any question about that. He's always looking at the process between him and somebody else. So that's a very succinct. I mean, there are certainly many ways of defining what is and isn't psychoanalytic. But Fromm is very involved in helping people become more conscious of what is not conscious. So that would be another way of looking at how he's psychoanalytic. He certainly is, from my point of view.
He also,
Please, Roger.
yes,
Yeah.
Rogers, please.
I wonder if I might just add to that, and I wholly agree with what Sandra just said, but I think we oftentimes associate Fromm with these books that he wrote for a much broader public, right? And what we overlook is who Fromm actually was. And so I just want to fill in that historical gap because I think it's enormously important. Fromm trained at the Berlin Psychoanalytic Institute. He was a member of what was called the Children's Seminar. It was called that because these were the younger analysts. The three main individuals in that seminar were Otto Pfennichel, Wilhelm Reich, and Erich Fromm. All of the members were Social Democrats or Communist Party members, and all of them had a radical, progressive view of psychoanalysis. It was in the context of that work that they began to use the term social psychoanalysis to refer to clinical psychoanalysis in order to integrate society into the clinical situation. In 1930, Erich Fromm was hired by Max Horkheimer, the director of the Institute for Social Research, to be the director of psychoanalysis and social psychology, a position he held for 10 years at the Institute for Social Research. That history is almost completely forgotten. In 1931, Fromm was diagnosed with tuberculosis, and he had to go to Davos to recover, to Switzerland, to a sanatorium. Horkheimer was so concerned about losing Fromm's help that he actually wrote to Freud. And he wrote to Freud saying that Fromm had come down with this illness, that he was worried, and in the event that Fromm would not be able to come back, did Freud have any recommendation? I think, and Fromm's analyst was Hans Sachs, one of the original 5 disciples of Freud. That's important to know. Not only that, Fromm was a founder or co-founder of 5 different psychoanalytic institutes and organizations, all of which still exist today. And yet, we still pose the question, to what extent was Fromm a psychoanalyst? And that is fascinating in and of itself because it speaks to the struggle of what to do with a psychoanalyst who doesn't write extensively about clinical work, but rather writes about society and politics. And I think it says something about our profession and the struggle we have with individuals who don't fit our pre-existing understanding of what we imagine a psychoanalyst should be writing about. Right? So I just want to fill in that historical background because I think it's essential to know.
Let me add to that. That's a very good point, Roger. Let me just add to that. Fromm sold millions of books to millions of people, not all of whom were psychoanalysts. And I think in my view, there's a kind of envy of people in the field who actually can cross over and sell millions of books. The same kind of thing, in a way, happened with Rollo May, who was also at the William Lansing White Institute and sold millions of books. And people would question whether he was really bona fide, And so I think there's more than one layer, let's say, of why that question comes up.
I just want to make the point that my question was not coming from the point of view of the psychoanalytic police, like if he was psychoanalytic enough, but a real curiosity how he combined the psychoanalytic ideas about the unconscious, or building the person's narrative, interpretations, and so on, drive theory, defenses, and is extremely humanistic ideas, and of being with the person and creating the unique language of the person, and challenging schemas. So it's a real curiosity how we combined the two traditions, not if he was kosher.
Good to know. Okay, well, just two ideas let me just put in there. One is one from Neil McLaughlin, which is recent, and is a wonderful writer, that Fromm had optimal marginality, by which he meant that Fromm had one foot in sociology and one foot in psychoanalysis. And that because of that, many people have derided him for that. Again, going back to the police. But Neil was saying, and I agree with Neil, that it was an advantage, that because he was in part in two different fields, he could look critically at each field, but he also knew the language of each one. He was an insider, outsider. And Roger could speak to this more than I, but that was his position as a Jew in Germany. That was his position as the only child in his family. In other words, he had one foot in two places in more than one period of his life, let's say, an aspect of his life. So he had practice with it. But what you're also raising is one of his central concepts was the concept of social character. Social character is a way of being that allows, that is, in a sense, promoted by the social cultural situation that you're living in. It's a pattern in the sense that it gets transmitted by the family. And so, for example, there are periods of time and cultures in which marketing orientation, what he called the marketing orientation, flourishes in the society. This way of valuing yourself according to how the market values you. So that's one of the social character, non-productive social characters that Fromm talked about. There are many other aspects to this, but the concept of social character is key to understanding how he integrated looking at society and looking in depth at a human being psychoanalytically.
Perhaps if I might just add two quick points to what Sandra just said, which I thought was extremely relevant. One is in the appendix to Escape from Freedom, you can find Fromm's essential summary of what interpersonal psychoanalysis is. And so the question, what was Fromm's psychoanalytic approach? Really, that question can only be answered by stating what is interpersonal psychoanalysis. Because, of course, Fromm, together with Sullivan and Claire Thompson and Frieda von Reichmann, created the interpersonal school, which in turn strongly influenced the relational school. And in that work and in some of the other very early works from Fromm, we have the first use of the term interpersonal, right? So he essentially coined that term, which later on then became the name of this new school of psychoanalysis. And so it's a much broader question, but essentially, yes, the early interpersonalists essentially do away with the drives, right? And they see the mind as fundamentally social in nature, structured by the interpersonal relationship, developmentally as well as in the present, but also for Fromm, structured by social forces, economic and political forces. And working psychoanalytically means engaging the person and understanding what evolves in the interpersonal or relational interaction with the patient. I also recently had a chance to speak with Edgar Levinson, who was an early graduate, is still vibrant and alive at, I believe, around age 100, if I'm correct, Sandra.
Yes, that's right.
And was in supervision with Fromm in the 1950s. And what he told me was that, Fromm had many of the characteristics of a more traditional psychoanalyst, since of course his own training analysis was very traditional. But he also was always asking how the patient exists in society and how they are shaped by social forces. And he was also always conscious of the ways in which those social forces were shaping the analyst and the interaction. Right? So if we were to think about the unconscious, we could ask, what are we seeing and not seeing as a result of the ways in which we as analysts have been shaped, and the values and the assumptions we bring to bear in our work with patients, right? So I think there's a lot there that can really expand our understanding of the analytic process, focusing specifically on the role of society. But it is different from how we generally think about psychoanalysis.
And what?
Yeah, just to play off that for a moment. So before I became an analyst, I was a emotion researcher, and one of the questions that got talked about a lot is, what are the primary motives in the human being? What's primary? And Fromm put the relationship, interrelating as primary, and not aggression as primary. And that, to me, that difference, those two things have huge consequences in a session, because just a patient is being very aggressive toward me. What do I assume? What do I assume? Do I assume with Fromm that some kind of life force, biophilia, flourishing, has been blocked? Or do I assume this aggression is primary? This is what it's part of just being a human being. And where do I go with each of those assumptions? How does each assumption focus me differently in the session? That's my interest.
And what is the place of the unconscious in Fromm's thought?
Sandra?
The place of the unconscious, well, the unconscious is that he used, unfortunately, man instead of human or humankind. So he said the unconscious is the total man. In other words, it's all that we potentially could be aware of if we didn't have the social filter that filters away some of the things that we just can't be conscious of because our particular culture and society wouldn't be advantageous. So so it's the total man, total human, let's say. That's what the unconscious is for him, for Fromm. And that's where we're trying to go in treatment, in a sense, toward the total human, toward, he says in one place, if I have eyes, I have the need to see. If I have ears, I have the need to hear, etc. It says, whatever is in you, you need to express, to connect with. And it's society's job to help you flourish, to help you become all that you could become, be all that you could be. That's society's job. To whatever extent it doesn't do that, it's failing.
So it's self-fulfillment, like you have to fulfill your potential.
Exactly right. And that's why Fromm was not, and he was criticized by some of the Frankfurt group for this, but it wasn't true. Fromm was not an advocate of adaptation to society. In fact, he was the opposite. He wrote many times that the clinician is the physician of the soul. He used that Plato's phrase, the physician of the soul, not an adaptation counselor. It's very firm and consistent in Fromm, that idea. So he's trying to help each individual become all that that person could be.
And to make more conscious the social forces that the social and the interpersonal forces that
Correct.
affect our development or ability to fulfill ourselves.
And as Rog'er just said, what happens if the analyst or clinician has the same social filter as the patient? Or what happens if we're from the same society and we can't be conscious of the same things? Well, what happens is that the treatment is limited by that.
And if you can expand, if Fromm believed that each of us has a inner born self, something we bring with us that we want to fulfill, or what we want to fulfill is also a result of the interaction. Is there a authentic self or like something that is our inner self is something we bring with us to the world, or it's also the result of the social interaction?
My understanding of Fromm is that there's a kind of that both the fundamental human being that we all are, the aspects of being human that we have in common and bring to the world, in interaction with our interpersonal experience, including our social experience, our family experience, that the two are, there's a synergy in a sense between the two, that they both shape who we are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe I can speak to different aspects of that. First of all, I think it's enormously important to understand and remember that Fromm essentially did away with the intrapsychic model of mind. In doing away with the intrapsychic model of mind, the question that emerges is what happens to the dynamic unconscious as we traditionally understand it, right? Because of course it's linked to the drives and to the intrapsychic model of mind. So it's fundamental to understand, as Sandra was just pointing out, that Fromm was a sociologist. And Fromm fundamentally believed that who we are is a shaping by social forces, right? We are fundamentally shaped by society. We emerge as individuals, and that's, I think, what Sandra was just saying. And as individuals, we have the possibility of, in turn, shaping our society. But first and foremost, we are social beings shaped by social forces in which we emerge. And unless we understand that, he believed we ultimately revert back to an intrapsychic model that makes it very difficult to account for the social and environmental world. So he was essentially taking this traditional model of psychoanalysis, the classical one within which he was trained, and turning it on its head. And this was a very radical thing to do. He did this in the mid-1930s. And he didn't make many friends in the process. In fact, it's as a result of doing this that he was pushed out of the Institute for Social Research. Adorno and Horkheimer felt that he was too critical of Freud, and that in moving away from Freud's theories of drives, they were left, I mean, that sort of hollowed out a key aspect of the theories that they were working on. And so, again, I think it's easy to overlook the radicality of Fromm's work, right? In part because, to a certain extent, it's just filtered into our general understanding today. But Fromm paid dearly for it. He was ostracized, and he was later on summarily kicked out of the International Psychoanalytic Association as well. and he wasn't even told, right? So it was, I think it was not an easy process. And one question that so often comes up is, why didn't he write more clinically? My own experience in going back and looking at a lot of this information is his early papers from the 1930s that were written in German. They were published primarily in the Journal of the Institute for Social Research. They were clinical. Mm-hmm. After he was kicked out of the Institute for Social Research, I think he was really injured. And he suddenly found an audience that went well beyond the psychoanalytic readership. I mean, Escape from Freedom sold 5 million books. And by the end of World War II, it had been published into 13 different languages. And he was suddenly moved from being a refugee analyst to sort of a global intellectual celebrity. And what was really fascinating to me in researching this was Escape from Freedom was very, very positively reviewed across all kinds of media in society. The main negative reviews came from classical psychoanalysts. I would read you just one. In The Nation, Karl Menninger, right, wrote, and I quote, "Erich Fromm was in Germany a distinguished sociologist. His book is written as if he considers himself a psychoanalyst," end quote. Right? And then he just sort of launches into a critique of Fromm's account of psychoanalysis. Why? Because Fromm was really shaking up a general understanding, right? He was doing away with the traditional understanding of drives and the dynamic unconscious and the intrapsychic model. So, I mean, I find this fascinating, right? This moment in history, in the history of our field.
One of the things.
Yeah, let me just say one application of this, because I think it's important. It's important to go in a sense from the macro to the micro and back and forth in this. So my own way as I first met a patient, this first question I would often ask is, tell me the situation you were born into. And that was a question, but it was also a statement that we're each born into a situation we did not create. And the situation you were born into is important for us to look at. So I'm just trying to say the ideas, the connection, the idea of us each being a social being can be applied in a specific, concrete way in our work.
One of the criticism that were made against Fromm, that he had superficial optimism. And when you read even Sandra, what you wrote about the integrity and the courage of the analyst, it seems a little bit describing an ideal therapist, whereas much of the literature today, especially from relational authors, discusses how we therapists cannot be ideal, and even that it is dangerous to strive to be an ideal therapist. What do you think, Sandra?
Well, first of all, I would distinguish between him being an optimist, which Roger, you can help me with this, but I do not think he was an optimist. I mean, I think, he talked, for instance, about people in his society being like patients on the critical list in an ICU. I mean, the society itself was on the critical list. That was in an interview that was published in 1986 posthumously, but he that's what he believed. He was not an optimist. He did, in my view, he was not anyway, but he did, however, espouse values. And when Roger was talking before about the appendix to Escape from Freedom, I was thinking about a part of that which is called the credo. I believe. Each sentence starts with I believe X, Y, and Z. And it talks about his values. He did assert values. He was reaching for an ideal. I don't think that means that he believed that we are ideals, that we're ideal analysts or people, but to reach for it, yes, he did stand for that. Not an optimist, though, not in my book.
But
if I may, very quickly, Fromm described himself as being hopeful.
Hopeful.
He didn't describe himself as being an optimist.
Yeah.
And I think the criticism that Fromm was an optimist actually stems from the Freudians originally, because Fromm let go of the death drive and he let go of the notion of innate aggression. And yet, Fromm's two, I think, most deeply researched books both dealt directly with human destructiveness. Right? Escape from Freedom and Anatomy of Human Destructiveness from 1973. And he actually responds to these critiques as well. Right? So these critiques were very much a part of psychoanalytic politics in the post-war period, particularly in North America.
We have
Yeah, I mean,
yes, go on, Sandra.
he does at some point, I forget where, talk about that he doesn't think that values like integrity, courage should be analyzed as something else. You know, I don't remember where he said it, but he's very, very firm about that, and about hope, which he also wrote about as active hope. He took the concept of active hope and he credits Ernst Schachtel with it. Ernst Schachtel in 1959 wrote a book called Metamorphosis, which was extremely important in the era that I trained. It's not an easy book, but it's a very important book, basically about perception. And in that book, Schachtel talked about basically active as opposed to passive hope. Fromm did believe in a kind of active hope where we try to make something that we want occur. We work toward it, and we have active hope about it, including about the treatments that we do. So he was very hopeful, exactly right, but not necessarily thinking that everything's just going to be, hunky-dory. I don't think he did.
We have several questions from people from the audience. David tries to understand what is the difference between Erich Fromm's attempt to understand society and Freud's attempt to understand society, especially when Freud wrote papers like Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego. So Freud also tried to look at social phenomena. What is the difference between them?
Well, one difference is, again, what's primary. I mean, for Fromm, and this has been picked up and worked on in different ways by the relational group, for Fromm, the relationship is primary. The social is primary. It's what's put in the driver's seat, in a sense.
Yeah, I think we can think about this to some degree also epistemologically, and that is that what we have in generally, and I'm speaking in generality, in the Freudian model is using an internal model of mind and notion of drives, and then applying that internal model of mind to societal phenomena. Right? And Fromm, and many others too, would argue that there's a problem with doing that because an internal model of mind can't possibly understand societal phenomena or use to be understand what societal phenomena are. And again, Fromm essentially turns its head and he says we have to start with the idea that we are fundamentally social beings shaped by society. And only then can we begin to understand what happens in the mind. So that society or group phenomena aren't secondary to what happens intrapsychically. They are, in fact, as Sandra just said, primary, right? So it's, again, a reversal of sorts.
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear from that how the relational approach was so inspired by what you're saying. And we have another comment by Ayelet Raz, which has many things to do exactly with what you said just now. Ayelet writes, I feel Fromm was a major precursor for a lot of concepts later to be created and discovered. Fromm was the first to coin the term the unlived life, later used by Adam Phillips and Thomas Ogden. He stressed the power of society not to enable to fulfillment of the potentials of lives, and these unlived life are the source of destructiveness and evil. Furthermore, it's amazing to find very similar terminology regarding person-environment relationship to Winnicott. But while the later refer to the mother as environment, Fromm referred to the social environment.
And I would also add that Fromm placed a very strong emphasis in the 1930s on the role of family. So not just the mother, but the family unit, and the way that the family unit itself becomes the medium through which the individual, the child, is shaped by society. So the family essentially becomes the social filter.
A number of years ago in Berlin, we had a meeting about how Fromm influenced various fields: psychology, psychoanalysis, sociology, linguistics, philosophy, etc. And in preparing for that meeting, I thought about how Fromm influenced me, and I had what for me was a very interesting discovery, which was that some of the things I'd written that I thought were my ideas, I realized actually were Fromm's ideas. And I asked myself, well, I'm not a plagiarist. I didn't do this on purpose. But I look back at my early writing and said, well, how did that happen? Is it that I absorbed something from my own analysts and supervisors and teachers, all of whom worked with Fromm? So is it that I absorbed it but didn't realize that, and then thought this is my, just wrote it as my idea? Or so I'm offering that as a question of how come it is that we see a lot of Fromm's ideas in more current or later analysts with Fromm not credited. And sometimes I think this isn't something done on purpose. It's we absorb ideas not realizing all of what we're absorbing, and then we come up with them. And I think that happens a lot in the history of at least psychoanalysis and probably other fields as well.
Can I ask about if you can share about, it's not the technique, but the style of his therapeutic work? Was he like, what was the I don't know, the flavors of how he worked, actively, passively, interpretatively, or like more speaking about what we think about the world? Was, if you know about his therapeutic works, since he didn't share a lot of therapeutic interaction, were they philosophical or more personal? If you have some.
Well, he told people exactly what he was going to do. He described in the first sessions, he described, I'm going to observe things and I'm going to tell you what I observe. He told people exactly what he was going to do. And he believed in what he called, you stick your neck out as a clinician, meaning you don't worry so much whether the patient's ready to hear something. When you're worrying about that, that's probably really what in our language now we would call countertransference. It's really you're worrying about how this is going to land with the patient. It's not that you know that the patient isn't ready for something. You stick your neck out. When you see something, basically you say it. So he was very direct, very interactive, which is another difference from the Freudian model. And I think very honest, and as he called it, center to center.
And I also want to add, because he didn't write much about clinical technique or give case examples, what has happened is that people have read into his work, oftentimes their own political perspective. So even within the interpersonal school, you have Sullivanians sort of criticizing the From's approach, right? And it's fascinating in and of itself. I participated in helping put out a book called The Clinical Erich Fromm, probably 15 years ago, which were accounts given by supervisees and analysans of Fromm. And what comes through, as Sandra says, is that he was very direct and he was very interactive. What doesn't come through, and this is the critique that's often made, is that he was difficult and insensitive. And so when we hear that critique, I think it's always important to ask who's making it and for what reasons, right? So, but this is, he's sort of, he's oftentimes a figure on which I think there's been a lot of projection, right? And it's important to take that into account as we try to understand how he worked and what he actually said from what he didn't say and from the ways he didn't work.
A few of my friends actually worked with him, Sonia and Salvador in Mexico. He was, he spent some of his career in Mexico and was very influential in Mexican psychoanalysis. And so they have said to me that he was demanding in a certain way. And he had a kind of a high bar, an expectation for you. If you may or may not experience that as harsh or hurtful. I think some people did and some people didn't. And I totally agree with Roger. Fromm is kind of like a Rorschach, a lot of people project different things onto him for their own reasons.
But if you have an idea, or if you can share, like, was the conversation more philosophical?
No.
Did you share it?
No.
Conceptual work, or more personal?
It was not philosophical. He was against abstraction, really. I call it the level of abstraction. He wanted to work at the level of abstraction of what happened, what the person felt, what he saw, what they saw. Very specific, not at all philosophical.
He actually said in the 1950s, he gave a series of lectures at the William Allinson White Institute about clinical work. That's one of the few pieces we have from him. And he said, one of the worst things an analyst can be is boring. And so also many of the people who worked with him said there was a sense of aliveness in working with him. One really felt that sense of aliveness. What also comes through is he could be quite political. Right? Politics had a place in the therapeutic setting, and that too was radical. I mean, even today it's radical, but at the time when he was writing this, it was, again, to use the English saying, it ruffled some feathers, not in the right direction.
Well, so Rainer Funk, who Roger spoke of, was Fromm's assistant in the last 8 years of Fromm's life, and worked with him and wrote a wonderful book called Life Itself is Also an Art. Is that I forget exactly the wording, but it is a book that juxtaposes Reiner's experience of Fromm with some of Fromm's ideas and writing. So you can see the connection between the way, at least Reiner experienced the actual man, and Fromm's ideas. And you see many times Reiner wrote that after hours and hours with Fromm, he would feel energized. He would go home and write some of his own stuff because he had so much energy. And a number of people wrote about how Fromm electrified them in a sense. One time, I think Fromm wrote something like, the analytic hours should be some of the most interesting hours in the person's experience of life. That's I think really what he lived and wanted to be for people.
Can I one other thing that I think is important? So as a professor, or when I teach candidates or psychotherapists in training, I don't recommend that people simply pick up a book of Fromm from the 1950s and start reading. Because it's really important to understand that Fromm's works, written from 1941 through 1976, were really focused on contemporary issues of that period. And he was writing in the style of that period. So unlike some analytic writers that we might be used to reading, he's focusing on a broad audience and speaking to issues in a general manner. And it oftentimes really conflicts with our analytic sensibility that we develop in terms of our readings. And I mean, for example, Fromm was not Adorno. Fromm's works were not like, he was not an Adorno in terms of being a philosopher like that. He actively believed in the importance of writing for a general audience. And that was both a plus, since he felt that change happens in society, but it was also a drawback in terms of reaching the analytic community. Because those aren't the kinds of books we tend to read, nor are those the kinds of books we tend to recommend to our students, right? And so this is, again, one of the challenges in addressing from a contemporary perspective. But I would like to emphasize, again, there are those papers from the 1930s that only in the last 15 years have been translated into English, where one really gets the sense of Fromm writing for an analytic community. And they're different in nature.
I have a personal anecdote to say about that. When I was trying to write my first book, and I wanted the analytic press at that time, now it's Routledge, to publish my book. And the editor, managing editor, was Paul Stepansky, a wonderful man who wrote many books of his own. And I was talking to Paul for the first time and what I wanted to write. And he said, well, I'd like you to write your first book in jargon. And I said, why, Paul? You want to sell books, don't you? And not that many people are going to buy a book in jargon. He said, because I want you to be respected. And then you could write anything you want after that. And I think that's very much what Roger's talking about there. What, we're used to a certain kind of, or analysts were at least used to a certain kind of jargon. That's what was respected.
We have a very interesting question from Drew Orenstein, who is asking, I have some patients who are not the least bit political, even currently. I wonder how Fromm might have dealt with that. 0 shred, not voting, 0. What do you think?
Sandra?
Well, I don't really know. That's a good question. I think he might have thought that something was being dissociated. And if it was, he would, every analytic theoretical point of view, to me, is really about focus. What do you focus on in this session? And I could look at every analytic theory from that point of view. So I think Fromm might focus on the absence of political content, whereas another analyst might not focus on that. He might think about during the session, I wonder why that's absent. What else? What can I understand about that? what might be dissociated here. That might be his focus, whereas another analyst wouldn't be looking for it.
I would also add, again, this is also my experience teaching at different psychoanalytic institutes over the years. When I've been asked to propose courses, I've often proposed courses on social theory and political theory and its importance for psychoanalysis. And they've always said, yeah, perhaps as a fourth-year elective, we can include that. From's point would be, unless and until we understand that these issues need to be taught to candidates in the very first year, in the very first semester of training, we will never understand that these ideas are always present in the room, and that it's not asking about this is not something extra that we're bringing into the room. It's always already in the room. Right? And so I think from the very start of working with a patient, there would be questions about how the patient exists in society, how they are shaped by society, how they experience society. And that, I think, is the key difference. I think for many of us, given how we've trained, we struggle with how to bring this into the session.
Mm-hmm.
From his perspective, again, it's always already in the session.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So Roger's bringing up the focus in training, and that is sort of a parallel to the focus in the session. You know, what do we hear? What are we looking for? What are we realizing is missing? What are we connecting, linking with our own feelings, or with another session, or with whatever, with the person's background, with, you know, were their parents not political?
Mm-hmm.
You know, what does non-political mean in that particular person's experience of life? You know.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but if I understood correctly, the main theme of to what situation were you born? So you can have different situations for the same phenomena. Like different patients can be non-political from variety of reasons. It's not
absolutely, absolutely right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We have another question from Noga Guggenheim.
Mm-hmm.
She asks, were there in his work the buds of mutuality and self-disclosure, terms that are relational cornerstones?
Yes, absolutely. Mutuality is a term that appears very early in his work, back in the 1930s, right? The notion of self-disclosure, of course, that can be variously defined. It can mean different things depending on the context in which we talk about it, is also present. It's present from his very endorsement of Ferenczi's approach in 1935, from his interactions with Ferenczi in the late 1920s and early 1930s, right? So yes, both of those concepts are extremely relevant.
And I would say contrasting with Sullivan, who didn't really write about mutuality in any sense.
Was he open person? Did he talk about his his own experiences, or was he private?
Go ahead.
In my experience, he was private, right? And I think that can be understood culturally, right? He was German, you know, raised in the 1910s and 1920s and 1930s in that very specific intellectual environment, and one did not talk about oneself. He changed with time, and it's important to remember he was living in the United States only for 15 years, from 1934, 35 until 1950. In 1950, he moved to Mexico City, where he lived for the next 22 years. and he set up the first psychoanalytic institute in Mexico City. He was submerged in the culture of Mexico City, and that also shaped his work. Right? And so we have in Fromm sort of a decolonializing perspective in his later works, right? That I think it's just worth remembering.
I mean, it's also referring back to something Roger said before. There's very little case material. So exactly what he did in a session, we have to assume, you know, we don't factually really know that much.
Well, I think we can't talk about Fromm without mentioning The Art of Loving.
No.
That book was published in 1956 and became Fromm's most successful and widely read work, establishing itself as a cultural phenomenon that transcend traditional academic boundaries. Why this particular book sold millions of copies worldwide?
Can I jump in and just provide some background to that book? Because I think it's important. Fromm was living in Mexico City. His second wife, Henny Gerland, had tragically died a few years earlier. It was her health. She was also a refugee, and it was her health that led them to move to Mexico City. And he was contacted by a publisher and philosophy professor in New York City who said to him, we have this new series that we're starting and we're asking different people to write about different subjects. We wonder whether you could write a small book about love. It's not a book that he had planned to write, nor was he working towards writing a treatise on love. This was a small book that was meant for a broad audience, and it was written in the middle of the 1950s, a highly conservative decade. And because it was written for a broad audience, the ideas therein, specifically about gender, are much more traditional in comparison to how he talks about gender and relationships in other books. Right? And what's fascinating to me is, as you say, it's touched a chord. This book sold somewhere between 25 and 30 million copies worldwide to date. Continues to sell. For Fromm, it was never something that he saw as a major part of his work. It was something that happened, almost happened to him. One difficulty is, of course, psychoanalysts today, if they want to try to understand Fromm, reach for this book, because of course it's about love, so it's going to tell us something, right? But that's not where we're going to find the essential aspects of Fromm the psychoanalyst. And so I just want to point that out, but it is absolutely fascinating that this book has, one, come to define him, in part because that was never the idea, and two, reach such a broad audience.
But, you know, movies, books about love also sell a lot. I mean, why is that a phenomenon? It's something people are very interested in. And Fromm had met the love of his life, Anis, who everyone that I've heard say anything about this said that they really did have an extremely evident love for each other. And so love had also come into his life.
But there are also some serious thoughts about love. There, very original thoughts about love. It's not the way people used to think about love. First of all, the art of love means that you need to be committed, and his link about loving and understanding is also very unique. It has less the component of something that is pleasant and joyful, and has a little bit of touch of work, of commitment, responsibility.
Yes.
Very
absolutely.
About giving rather than receiving and needing. I think one way to understand his conception of love, and I try to point this out in the book, is number one, a response to the historical period. I mean, the Holocaust had ended less than 10 years before he was writing this book. The Korean War was raging, in which 4 million people died, right? And it was a response to that period. Right? At the same time, when you look at this book and you compare it, for example, to Martin Buber, right, you find many of the same ideas present. And that's not by chance, because Fromm emerged within and worked within the dialogical tradition of philosophy. Right. So many, I think, Anna, you're pointing to that. Many of those ideas can be philosophically understood in relation to dialogical approaches.
I think where you get the idea of work, he did think about love as a practice, something you practice. In other words, loving, he thought about it as a verb. And as Roger said, he thought about giving love rather than being loved as the focus. And he thought about how people can love but still and be concerned about the other and both people retain their individuality, not give that over, not fusion, not love as fusion, but love as an activity that includes caring, concern about the other human being. So he did have very, you're right to say, very important, interesting, and different ideas about love.
Roger, it's very interesting to hear briefly your own personal familial history and how they connect to the subject of your research.
Sorry, was that a question? Would you like me to talk about that? Or?
Yes, if you can tell the audience, not everyone knows your personal history.
Sure. It's certainly something I've written about. In fact, I've been working in the area of specifically German memory and the Holocaust, traumatic memory. And it was in the context of doing that work that I literally stumbled on these letters in Fromm's family, which I felt absolutely obligated to bring to life. They're enormously powerful. And if you have a chance to read them, it's easy to access the book through libraries. You don't need to buy it. But I mean, you'll get a sense of that. I also felt it was important to bring these letters to light because of my own background. And that is that my family is German, although I grew up mainly outside of Germany. I discovered late in life, in fact, not until I was in my 40s, that my grandfather I had known was a member of the Nazi Party. It was something that in my family had been silenced, that no one talked about. There was a lot of shame associated with it. I grew up in a liberal and progressive family. Rather than confronting this past, it was covered over in silence. And I was confronted with trying to make sense of this as a psychoanalyst, and as a psychoanalyst who has also worked with many patients who are members of Holocaust surviving families. And so this was very, very present for me in doing this work. And also, I think most particularly in understanding Fromm's arguments in Escape from Freedom about how it was that his contemporaries, people he grew up with in the same neighborhood, supported Hitler and turned against their own neighbors. And of course, my grandfather was the same age as Fromm. He lived in Berlin at the same time as Fromm. And so this made doing this work enormously poignant for me, and oftentimes very difficult, right? So I think that's the background to it. And I actually talk about that in the book because I did not feel that I could ethically write about this or translate the letters without also first sharing my history so that the reader knew it and didn't learn about it later on. And so I made the choice, a difficult one, to actually bring my own family history into my discussion, which was somewhat controversial, I think, for some readers, understandably.
But do you think that Fromm could be empathic to the situation of people who were structured into fascist way of being, like what, if you can imagine, or what is your estimation that what was his capacity for people who were structured to not to be free, but to be, that were structured into authoritarian situation?
Yeah, I think what you're pointing out is absolutely essential. And this was the essence of Fromm's approach, right? It was an empathic approach, trying to understand how these people were shaped in such a manner that they were willing to support a regime that was ultimately bent on genocide, right? That he believed that as psychoanalysts, we need to find a way to understand that process, and that process cannot be explained through drives, through an aggressive drive. Rather, the aggression that we see, the hatred that we see, has to be understood as forming in society. Because if we're going to create change, we can't just create change in the individual. We also have to understand the social forces so that we can address them. Right? So this was his approach, and I think there was a powerful quotient of empathy involved in that.
Did he ever? Sure, Sandra.
Just to share for a moment, my first outpatient that I ever saw was an American Nazi, who only found out that I'm Jewish a couple of years into the work. And I won't go into, we don't have a lot of time, I won't go into the details about that. But so I had a sort of firsthand experience of empathic work with someone whose ideology I absolutely abhorred. So I think it is possible therapeutically to have empathy in a way for other aspects of who that human being is also, and without in any way agreeing with the ideology.
Yeah, distinguishing empathy from sympathy. Absolutely.
And if you maybe towards the end of our very interesting conversation, if you can expand a little more, what were his idea about how to affect the social forces? How can people make a difference, or make a change, or create freedom in a situation where freedom is not obtained? And it corresponds with Josh Weiss' question in the chat. I'm wondering about your thoughts as Fromm scholars about these insane days politically, and about us who are in unbending war. If you want to comment.
Well, just I could say that Fromm was an activist, and particularly in the issues of nuclear proliferation. He was one of the founders of SANE, the organization. He believed in activism, and he didn't just believe it; he lived it.
Yeah, I think Fromm's, just as Sandra said, Fromm's life is a really good example of that. He was choosing not to write specifically for a psychoanalytic audience. He wrote about social and political issues because he hoped to have an impact. And by all means, he did have an impact. He commanded enormous audiences, something that's difficult for us to imagine today, writing a book. And he also believed that the psychotherapist needs to work with individuals, patients, but also needs to be active in society. So he really shows us the model of being both a psychotherapist and a social activist. He believed that the two go together.
You know, I kind of think that we each find our own way of contributing in a sense. You know, Fromm also was a speechwriter for Eugene McCarthy, someone who tried to become president of the United States. He used his writing ability in his activism. Somebody else might use some other talent or ability that they have to try to promote what they believe in.
I think there is here a sentence that's cited by Elaine Philipson. It's a wonderful ending to our conversation. And she writes, Fromm said, satisfaction in individual love cannot be attained without the capacity to love one's neighbor. Thank you so much for this conversation. It was very, very inspiring and just what we needed in these awful, awful days.
Thank you for
so
making
much.
it happen.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you.
for the honor of the invitation.
And thank you for the inspiration and for the encouragement to be an activist. We'll try.
Yeah.
And you are welcome to stay to read the responses of the audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.